Mental illness.
The scene was one of absolute confusion. Shots were ringing out. The nightmare was unfolding.
Botched robberies.
Arlene Mcneil was shot in the head during an armed robbery at McDonald's.
Destruction.
Shooting suspect is inside the McDonald's. He is contained, moving around in there. Still shots being fired.
Today we'll look into two dark tales from McDonald's past that they'd rather the public forgot about. Because within the walls of this fast food chain, tragedy has been known to strike. Our first story begins in the quiet community of Sydney River, Nova Scotia. It all started as nothing more than a simple plot between three young friends, Derek Wood, Freeman McNeil, and Darren Muse. Over the previous winter, Wood and McNeil had spent time together planning to rob their small town's local McDonald's. The former had gotten a part-time job at the fast food joint in March of 1992, using the position to scope out the building more effectively. Over a couple months of work, Wood learned about a rarely used door in the basement of the establishment, which would be an ideal entry point for the heist. He believed that there would be about $200,000 in the restaurant's safe after a full day of sales, and that would be their target earnings from the robbery. And with this, the friends decided to execute their plan. But nobody could have predicted what would unfold when they did. It's unclear what made their scheme spiral out of control, but the events that were soon to take place would haunt the community for years to follow. It was a quiet night at 1 a.m. on May 7th, 1992, when the three friends entered the McDonald's through the basement door. Muse was wearing a mask, and both he and McNeil wore a second layer of clothing they planned to dispose of on their getaway. The trio were confident in their plan, not expecting to run into a soul since the restaurant was closed, but it fell apart almost instantly when they were discovered by two employees still there, Donna Warren and Arlene Mcneil, who it should be noted shared no relation to Freeman. The workers recognized their colleague Wood, since he was not disguised and had left from his shift only hours before. When they confronted their coworker about what he was doing back in the restaurant, he abandoned the plan of a clean robbery and shot Arlene in the head. Another worker, Neil Burrows Jr., was upstairs, cleaning the kitchen. He didn't hear the gunshot from below, nor did he hear Wood come upstairs to check the rest of the building. When the burglar found yet another unexpected witness, Wood shot Burrows, but the violence against him didn't end there. Burrows suffered the most brutal wounds of the night, as Muse also stabbed him repeatedly in the throat, and McNeil hit him with a shovel before shooting him again in the head. Wood returned to the basement and forced Warren upstairs to open the restaurant's safe, only to discover that the expected $200,000 was missing a few zeros. Instead, there was only about $2,000 inside. Regardless, Wood shot Warren dead and took the money. The three killers started to make their escape, but they encountered someone else on the way out. At that moment, James Fagan, another McDonald's employee, was unfortunately arriving for his late shift. He suspected nothing when he first entered the building, but soon became the gang's final victim. He was shot by Freeman McNeil before he and his friends fled the scene, escaping into the night. The taxi driver who had dropped Fagan off noticed the killers running away and returned to the restaurant to investigate. When he discovered the bodies, he called law enforcement, who arrived to find a scene more horrifying than they ever imagined they would encounter in their peaceful town. Burrows and Warren died as a result of their injuries at the scene, while Fagan passed away soon after. Arlene was the only survivor. The crime sent shockwaves through Nova Scotia, and it became one of the highest profile murder cases in Canada at the time. Police Sergeant Kevin Cleary, who was a lead investigator and one of the first officers at the scene, spoke about a shared disbelief that could be felt by the local populace. This was far outside of their realm of experience, and media from across Canada descended on Cape Breton to report on the incident. Journalist Fons Jessam later said that people in the community were having trouble believing that anyone in their town was capable of such horrific crimes. Thankfully, the killers were not on the run for long. By May 16th, all three of them were arrested. With the wounds from the event still fresh in the community's mind, many townsfolk made their presence known for the hearing. More than 100 citizens waited outside the courthouse in Sydney, screaming at the killers. While some demanded justice for their victims, others may have just wanted to see who in their community was capable of such an act. Derek Wood was the first suspect to confess and the first to be tried. Among other crimes, he was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for 25 years, and has not been granted any type of leave in his entire time behind bars. Like Wood, Freeman McNeil was sentenced to life in prison. Although he became eligible for full parole in 2017, he remains incarcerated. Darren Muse took a plea deal for the lesser charge of second-degree murder and was granted full parole in 2012 for good behavior. He completed his GED in prison, and as of May 2022, Muse is believed to be living in British Columbia. The 3 may have faded from public consciousness in a global sense, but the legacy of the massacre still lives on in Cape Breton. Kathy Burrows, Neil Burrows Jr.'s sister, has remained actively involved with the tragedy for decades, and she attends every one of the killers' parole hearings on behalf of the victims. When she was interviewed for the event's 13th anniversary, she stated that Wood was the only killer who had apologized and shown remorse for his actions. In her life and in the community at large, the McDonald's massacre remains one of the darkest days in memory. As for what happened to Arlene Mcneil, the only victim to survive the attack, she had a long recovery. The fast food worker spent months in the hospital and was left physically and mentally disabled for the rest of her life due to the bullet wound she had sustained. And years later, after the tragic events, she passed away in 2018 at the young age of 46. As for the restaurant itself, it attempted a reopening, but the local residents could only associate it with death, and their appetite didn't return. Now all that remains on the site of the Sydney River Massacre is an empty lot. But unfortunately, this was not the only tragic event to happen under the Golden Arches. We'll learn more about another harrowing tale after a brief word from our sponsor. In the modern age, it's so easy to eat garbage food that's available at a moment's notice. But what if I told you there was a healthier alternative that was both faster and cheaper than DoorDash or Uber Eats? This is where Factor comes into place, a service that delivers fresh, never frozen, dietitian-approved meals right to your doorstep. Their team of gourmet chefs create each meal using only ingredients with integrity to help you feel your best all day long. As a person who's always watching his weight, their calorie smart options are a great choice for when I'm having a busy day and don't want to spend a lot of time thinking about what I'm eating for lunch. I just pick whichever one looks the most appetizing to me that day, throw it in the microwave or oven for a few minutes, and there I have something to eat. And to be clear, there is no prep and no mess. Factor cuts out stressful meal planning and extensive prepping, so you have meals in no time. In a wellness market full of unrealistic diet plans, Factor is a welcomed and new approach to prepared food. They include premium ingredients with integrity. I definitely recommend you click that link in the description down below and use GFM 130 to get $130 off across 6 boxes. So go to go.factor75.com/GFM 130. James Huberty was born in Canton, Ohio in 1942. As a child, he was known by his family as moody and withdrawn, with a particular passion for guns. Despite these personality traits, he was able to find a sweetheart, and in 1965 married Etna Markland, and they soon had 2 children, but their domestic life was far from peaceful. Their neighbors overheard many violent disputes, as James was known to threaten his wife and daughters with a loaded gun on more than one occasion. One such incident led to both James and Etna being arrested for disorderly conduct, but it was not their last brush-up with authorities. James had another run-in with the law in 1980 during an argument at a gas station, and Etna was charged a year later on 4 counts of aggravated menacing when she pointed a semi-automatic pistol at a neighbor during an argument. This pattern of violence was fueled by James, who also began to worry about his mental health. He had been acting more erratic since losing his job and relocating his family to San Isidro, California. This led to him calling a San Diego mental health clinic to request an appointment, but he never received an answer. This call was placed on the day before his soon-to-be famous incident, and if someone had answered, perhaps the coming tragedy would have been avoided. July 18th, 1984 in California began normally enough. James suggested that he and Etna take their oldest daughter to the zoo. But as they were driving home, he told his wife, "Society doesn't have a chance." The rest of the day passed uneventfully until late in the afternoon, when James left the house dressed in combat gear. The last thing he told Etna was that he was quote-unquote going hunting for humans. After kissing his wife goodbye, James entered his truck armed with an Uzi carbine, a 12-gauge shotgun, many rounds of ammunition for each weapon, and the same semi-automatic pistol that Etna had once wielded against a neighbor. At approximately 4 p.m., Huberty pulled into the parking lot of a local McDonald's and casually walked inside, which is when things took a turn for the worse. At first, he aimed his shotgun at 16-year-old employee John Arnold, whose back was turned. Another worker warned him about the threat, but when Huberty tried to fire, the gun only clicked. The young man assumed that the gunman was playing some sort of distasteful joke, but it became all too real just moments later, when Huberty fired the Uzi at Neva Kane, the restaurant's manager, killing her on sight. The deranged man continued to spray bullets, wounding Arnold, and began to angrily rant that he had, quote, killed 1,000 and would kill 1,000 more. This claim was unfortunately not completely unfounded, as in the next 77 minutes, the McDonald's would come to resemble a war zone as he claimed 21 lives. The shooter made his way through the restaurant, mercilessly gunning down employees and patrons one by one. Some who were only injured played dead, hoping the crazed murderer would leave them alone. But he showed no restraint, and whole families were shot down while pleading for their lives. While a few employees were able to hide in a storage area, they too were also discovered and killed. Other victims were bystanders who approached the establishment while completely unaware of the shooting, including a group of 11-year-old boys. When the killing ended, the ages among the slain ranged from 74 years to only 4 months old. 19 more people were injured, and what should have been a typical summer day was shattered. The patrol car that responded to the first emergency call was hit by a few shots from Huberty. The car's driver, Officer Miguel Rosario, was backed up by a SWAT team within half an hour. The killer continued to fire at them, along with all the other emergency responders who arrived at the scene. The police were reluctant to enter the restaurant in case Huberty had any hostages, but eyewitness reports indicated that everyone inside had been killed. At 5:17, police sniper Charles Foster saw Huberty in his scope near the counter, looking almost like a customer waiting for an order. Foster took this opportunity to shoot and kill the lunatic, finally ending the standoff. This event shook the community to its core, as this was the deadliest mass shooting by a lone gunman in U.S. history at the time. The sheer amount of victims was a traumatic blow to anyone in the country. Police officers who were present at the bloody scene reported experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, which led to the formation of a group of psychologists who went on to be consulted in future mass shootings. The enormous impact of the event spread outward, with politicians using the incident to lobby for stricter gun laws. Many grieving locals wondered why Huberty's call to the clinic wasn't returned, and it was later discovered that his name had been misspelled as Schuberty in the clinic's records. In the weeks following the massacre, Etna Huberty and her daughters received numerous death threats, forcing them to relocate. When the children enrolled in their new schools, they had to do so under assumed names. In the aftermath, many wondered why Etna had done nothing to intervene before her husband left on the killing spree. A year after the tragedy, she stated she hadn't taken James' words seriously, despite his history of violence and instability. To help the families of the victims, McDonald's started a fund that quickly accumulated over $1 million, mostly in donations from the corporation itself. Etna Huberty irritated some in the community by publicly announcing that she would sell the book and film rights to her story. But unsurprisingly, she had no takers, and she later passed away in 2003. This McDonald's massacre remains a painful memory for all. Like in Sydney River, the restaurant itself was demolished, but the site was donated to the city and made into a permanent memorial to the victims. Several survivors and family members of those killed filed lawsuits against McDonald's and the San Diego Police Department, but all of them were dismissed. 40 years later, James Huberty's crimes have been equaled and surpassed many times over in the US, but hundreds still live in heartache from the McDonald's shooting spree. So there you have the story behind two tragic events that happened at McDonald's restaurants. A sad reality of having so many franchises across the world. And with that, I think I'll end the video here. So until next time, thanks for watching.